bienvenidos. My name is Melissa Yzaguirre, she, her pronouns. Today we're going to be discussing exposing unacceptable injustices and empowering and equipping family therapists with ethnic racial socialization practices. And going to get into what that means, what this all looks like, and hopefully y'all are able to walk away with some how-to applications for those of you that are clinically active and working with diverse Latino populations. So just a quick outline in terms of what we'll be going over. So we will be discussing an empirical study that was conducted, and we will also be going into a little bit about the literature review, where the research gap was, and how I attempted to fill it. And we'll briefly discuss the results of this empirical study, and we'll jump right into the clinical practice recommendations and round out with some clinical implications as well. I do want to acknowledge the folks at Michigan State University for funding. This was my dissertation, so very much appreciate them for supporting me and being able to not only give compensation to my participants, but also enough compensation to be able to conduct some quality research with this project. And this presentation applies to family therapists seeking to support Latino families facing exposure to discrimination in the United States. Culturally relevant clinical practices and training recommendations supported by this empirical study are offered to promote conversations related to race, ethnicity, culture, ethnic racial discrimination, and immigration with Latino parents in therapy. If I can get a just quick show of hands of those who have experience or exposure of working with Latino populations. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Going to try to get a lot of participation going this session. And then if along the way, I do encourage you to utilize the chat feature. I would like this to be a very engaging workshop. On a scale of 1 to 5, just out of curiosity, if you could please rank from 1 being the lowest to 5 being the most, the level of accessibility that you have to culturally relevant practices as a professional or part of your professional development opportunities. I'd like to get an understanding of where we all stand in terms of having access to these types of resources. Okay, so I'm seeing a 5 come in, 5, 4, 3, 3. Okay, about the average. Wonderful. Okay, so it seems like we are getting some exposure, which is fantastic, and we can never really get enough, right? There's always enough to go around. Some of us are here because we're looking for some more exposure. Wonderful. Thank you for that. And if I could have maybe 1 or 2 volunteers who would like to share their interest in this presentation topic or what they hope to walk away with. Feel free to unmute yourself and just give like a quick snippet to folks. One brave soul. I know I have 1 in the audience. I know I do.
My name is Brianna, and I'm an undergrad student, and I am really excited and encouraged to look at new ways that I can be more of a aware and multicultural counselor and really kind of identify where my white privilege comes in so I can be ahead of it before treating clients and really get a good grasp on it going in so I have a solid foundation for accessibility.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate it. So hopefully that's what we're going to get to today, right? And as we're going along, if any questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself if I didn't catch it. And we'll also have additional time at the end for some questions. So positioning a little myself as the researcher. So I recently completed my PhD in human development and family studies with the concentration in couple and family therapy at the Michigan State University. My research interests include increasing culturally relevant practices to mental health providers. And specifically, I have a specialty with working with Latino communities, using very intentional language here, which we can get into down the road. But this is my passion area, and being able to equip family therapists with being able to translate the different types of culturally relevant practices that they're taught to be adapted to the diverse populations that they are working with. So a little bit of background as we are living in an emerging majority minority society and what that means. So the content of this presentation, as I mentioned earlier, draws from an empirical qualitative dissertation entitled Family Therapist Lived Experiences of Discussing Ethnic Racial Socialization with Latino Parents. So, as we are very well aware, Latinos are the largest growing ethnic minority population in the U.S., with making up 18.5% of the U.S. population in 2020, or roughly 62.1 million individuals. And this is estimated to increase to 28% by 2060. However, the unfortunate reality is that the prevalence of ethnic racial discrimination is a very prevalent concern that exists in the U.S., which ultimately translates into disadvantages in different settings such as education, employment, medical care, public safety. And this ultimately does leave rising concerns about the long-term effects that this will have on Latino children's development, family well-being, and mental health outcomes. And within the body of literature, this concept or theoretical concept of ethnic racial socialization exists, where ethnic racial socialization has been identified being parent messages regarding race and ethnicity to children, and has been identified as a protective influence for families to cope with exposure to discrimination. Within mental health literature, many of us have likely been exposed to concepts of cultural humility or cultural relevance in different terminology of cultural competence, for example. And all of these things are essentially made to identify practices that are consistent with the values, beliefs, and desired outcomes of working with diverse populations, and ultimately help therapists to embrace the complexities that come with the client's identity and background. So in essence, we have this theoretical part on one side, these practices that exist on the other, but where the current gap that exists in the literature is the translation of some of these theoretical ethnic racial socialization concepts into translating them into the therapeutic setting, and ultimately being able to identify practices to support Latino parents to help them engage in these ethnic racial socialization conversations with their children. And thus, that's where this current study came about. So the research question consisted of, what do family therapists consider to be effective practices for supporting Latino parents to engage in ethnic racial socialization conversations with their children? And a bit about the participants. So I interviewed 20 family therapists, self-identifying family therapists across the US. And the criteria listed is just indicating where therapists, in order to meet eligibility for the study. But what was really fascinating and great about this opportunity was interviewing 20 family therapists across 10 US states and being able to identify what some of these patterns, either where they had similarities or differences when it came to having experience with discussing topics of ethnic racial socialization with Latino parents in therapy. I also had a very diverse population where therapists ranged in years of experience, years of age, their own ethnic and racial backgrounds, their linguistic skills, as well as their generational status. So in addition to being able to find out participant demographics, they also included some of the client demographics in which they've worked with. And these therapists have worked with Latino parents representative of 16 different ethnic backgrounds. The majority, roughly 70%, identified their clients as domestic. About 85 and 70% identified working with first generation and second generation Latino parents, as well as conducting, so this was about 75% of folks conducting bilingual services with Latino parents. And regarding the procedure, so this is just a little short snippet of some of the questions that were asked in the semi-structured interviews, where I essentially focus on three ethnic racial socialization domains that are well represented in the literature, specifically one being cultural socialization, the other being preparation for bias, and the rising domain of immigration socialization that has been identified specifically with Latino communities. So being able to start with broad questions, essentially asking what these conversations may have looked like by asking questions related to race, ethnicity, or culture, or discrimination or immigration, and then being able to continue these conversations and kind of broaden them out, but with follow-up questions. All of the interviews ranged from 52 minutes to 98 minutes. I conducted a thematic analysis identified by Braun and Clark, and what was really great about this process, so this 6-step process is supposed to be iterative and really not a one check the box item, right? And what was very beautiful about this process was, as I started going through the transcripts, between theme step 1 and 2, I started to recognize that there was a little bit of a disconnect in terms of some of the codes that were being identified. And between the generated labels that were coming about and the notes that I had, I came to the realization about six transcripts in that there were multiple voices that were actually being represented in these transcripts. So while I was conducting interviews with family therapists, they were also sharing their experiences from their own lens, as well as sharing the voices of their clients that they were working with. So in addition to being able to have qualitative data that represented the therapists themselves, they were also giving features and distinct lived experiences on behalf of the clients that they have worked with. So being able to interpret their clients' perspectives, parents, children, families, and the experiences that they had with them in therapy, which offered a really rich opportunity to get multiple perspectives in the ways that ethnic racial socialization shows up and how it is addressed in family therapy with Latino parents. And of this process, the results identified came out to 4 major themes, 11 sub-themes, and within these themes were identified as family therapist practices to ultimately promote ethnic racial socialization conversations with Latino parents. And thanks to the wonderful participants and their rich descriptions, also talking to me about the Latino children that were either directly or indirectly influenced from these conversations to ultimately protect them from factors or exposures to ethnic racial discrimination. So the findings from the current study, as I mentioned, yielded 4 major themes and 11 sub-themes, exploring the lived experiences of 20 family therapists who have worked with Latino parents in therapy. These themes and sub-themes captured the practices the participants in the current study utilized to promote ethnic racial socialization related conversations with their Latino parent clients. First, participants introduced the necessary groundwork before engaging in deeper discussions with the Latino parents. Next, participants spoke about the approaches to identifying and explicitly naming ethnic racial socialization related topics with Latino parents. Then the participants described the practices that they utilize to understand and help the Latino parents conceptualize the generational culture-related messages transmitted to their children. And finally, the participants highlighted several social influences that prompted their desire to continue advancing their promotion of ethnic racial socialization conversations with Latino parents in therapy. And there's plenty more that we could dive into in this, and it is all exciting stuff. However, I wanted to get straight to the meat of it and why you're here, which is give me the tools to be able to support these families when I start working with them. So I'm glad that you all requested that. We're going to get right into it. So we're going to jump right into family therapist practice recommendations. So the first one, or the first major theme, which was the therapeutic relationship groundwork, ultimately, the therapists all agreed that the investment in the therapeutic relationship was everything. And what they did in this process was also give rich descriptions of what they meant by the therapeutic relationship. Essentially, before being able to engage in these deep and personal dialogues related to ethnic racial socialization, whether it be talking about their culture, whether it be about exposure to discrimination or discrimination encounters, or their immigration history, the therapist must invest in the therapeutic relationship. And part of that, and essentially the three sub-themes that were emerging from the therapeutic relationship, the first one was embodying cultural humility, where the therapists all emphasize the necessity to remain open and curious about the complexities of working with diverse Latino cultural backgrounds. And essentially, rather than therapists saying, I have to know everything about all of their cultural backgrounds, it was much more about learning how to familiarize themselves and expand their knowledge through a cultural humility lens. So this usually ended up with avoiding assumptions and rather acknowledging and focusing on the lived experiences of their clients, really asking intentional questions here that were related to more understanding the client, but also acknowledging that it's okay to take a not knowing stance, in the sense where perhaps some of our training and our background typically tells us, don't make it about yourself, make it about the client. And in this study, the therapist actually gave the opinion of, how can we be intentional with the questions that we're asking so that it remains about the client. And yes, like the way for us to learn is to hear about their lived experiences. So it also gave an opportunity for therapists who may or may not have shared similar backgrounds with their clients to recognize some of those similarities and differences that existed in the room and in the dynamic. Second sub-theme referred to nurturing the connection. And what this looked like was being able to identify opportunities to promote trust in the therapeutic relationship. Given that a lot of these folks recognize that for many of them, the Latino parents that they were working with, a lot of them had never been exposed to therapy before. So in saying that this was a new setting for them, it was also an opportunity to work towards reassuring them that the therapist was there to help. And a lot of times that reassurance also kind of came towards acknowledging that they were working towards a common goal and respecting and identifying the cultural nuances that may be influential as part of the therapeutic process, as well as providing a background to therapy. So a lot of times trust and safety also included discussing and revisiting conversations related to informed consent, policies, procedures, the therapist socially locating themselves, and also describing their therapeutic practices. So for some of us, when we have, gotten into our clinical craft, we may have a way to approach certain conversations or the way that we approach new clients. However, here there was re-emphasis as to the importance of revisiting conversations, especially when it came to conversations related to immigration. When hesitations were encountered, therapists took it upon themselves to remind them that they had no specific ties to immigration services or to ICE, and they were very specific to give these details to their clients. I apologize. Okay. The lights like to go out in my office sometimes. I apologize. And then the third sub theme was promoting safety. And what did that look like? So essentially safety was targeted as being prioritized, but also described as an ability for their Latino clients to feel comfortable, heard, and understood. In many instances, I would have therapists telling me, I want them to know that they can come and this is a place to desahogarse, to just let it out and to vent. This is their place to feel comfortable, because for many of these parents, they've never had that opportunity or that sounding board. So it was an opportunity to remind their clients that this is a confidential space to engage in explicit conversations, and reminding them about the limitations and the terms of confidentiality. But it was also an opportunity to continuously revisit safety when sensitive topics were approached. So having a solid foundation before entering these conversations often helped the therapist to be able to dig deeper, and knowing and feeling secure that the conversations they were having, in a sense, they were earned by the therapist, and showing their clients that it was okay to have these conversations. The second major theme identified shifting implicit messages to explicit conversations. And essentially, this was an opportunity for therapists to begin to broach the ethnic racial socialization conversations by using direct language and defining the introduced terminology. So, for example, when parents would come in and saying, I have an issue because my child has been bullied at school. They are picking on him for speaking Spanish during class. And the therapist would introduce language such as, it sounds like he was experiencing discrimination. And certain terminologies, whether it be in that instance or sometimes when the term racism was brought up by the therapist and introduced to the client, clients tended to react in different ways. Some of them would say, very hesitantly, oh no, that wasn't it, and would try to shut down the conversation. And it was an opportunity for therapists to kind of normalize these conversations and say that, once again, having that safety allowed them to reassure them that it's okay to bring these conversations into the room. So let's explore a little bit of what each of these ethnic racial socialization domains look like. So the first one of exploring cultural identity, this was an opportunity to have in-depth conversations related to the client's background. And what this included was identifying and exploring the Latino client's cultural identities through broad conversations and questions. So again, that piece of being intentional, not having to have all the questions, but this could also be part of the joining process. Some of the therapists asked questions related to food, to music, to spirituality, gender norms. These types of conversations were normalized early on in not only the joining process, but also for those that perhaps the conversation didn't come as fluid or as easily. It was an opportunity for them to engage and show the clients, I want to know more about you and learn who you are. They were also strengthened by conversations where, when I asked therapists to give me a little bit more of an understanding of what they defined as culture, they gave very mixed messages of what culture was, but ultimately what they said was including terms like values and beliefs related to these cultural topics is what made a huge difference in understanding where these conversations ultimately led to. So an example could have been, I've noticed that one of the values that what the Latino parents had was regarding curfew and not staying out too late, or being at home at the certain time, and the children wanting to push back and saying, well, my friends don't have a curfew, my friends don't have this. And that pushback on authority is a value that the parents really frowned on, because they said, I never did this with my parents, why are the children doing it with me? And having to almost find that balance and understanding and getting that full definition of, talk to me more about the value of respect. It sounds like there's a value regarding respect here, something that is very commonly known within the Latino culture. Another area which therapists who did not identify as Latinos themselves, both those who identified, but also the emphasis of those who did not, identified the cultural nuances that were provided by their Latino clients, and acknowledging that perhaps sharing the cultural identity and background with your clients sometimes makes it a little bit easier to pick up on these physical gestures, certain sayings, and validating that experience, and also acknowledging why it's important to ask these questions, that when these things come up, or if we're not able to pick them up right away, also kind of validating that that's okay to not know it all, but perhaps that's part of the process of learning with them. Second subtheme that came up, or second domain, was related to ethnic racial discrimination and recognizing that. An interesting finding from this study, as well as the recommendations put forward by therapists, was not only normalizing the topic of ethnic racial discrimination in treatment, but also identifying when depending on the state you're living in, essentially is kind of what this boiled down to, or the location that you're in, recognizing if it's the Latino parents themselves being exposed to discrimination, or if they're the ones discriminating against others. And that was a very interesting finding part of this study, because that's not commonly talked about in the literature when you have a client that is the person who is discriminating against others. So when Latino parents were either sharing, implicit stories with messages that weren't exactly direct, it was more about the therapist introducing conversations and language surrounding discrimination, racial oppression, microaggressions. But while validating the experiences, it was also for those that were exposed to ethnic racial discrimination. It was about promoting this effort to resist those unacceptable injustices. An example that occurred was when a parent shared with their therapist, well, yes, I experienced racism at work, but I'm here undocumented. I should just be grateful that I have a job at all. And the therapist responding, just because you're here undocumented does not mean that you are less valuable than your colleagues, does not mean that you should accept this injustice that is happening to you. So while validating the experience, also pushing back and saying that you do not have to accept being treated less than because of your status. For Latino parents who were discriminating against others, the conversations were directed or redirected by the therapist. And one way that they did this was to tap into human values and to model non-discriminatory language. So, for example, when one parent came in and was talking about their child being discriminated against, the parent went on while the child was in the room to say, es porque son morenos, it's because they're Black. And the therapist redirected the conversation and said, it sounds like they were bullies. The children that were doing this to your child were bullies. And then the therapist went on to share that the child looked over to the parent and said, see, mom, I told you can't say that. So it was also this bi-directional effect that therapists were picking up regarding the language and the messages that are being sent, but also no longer being accepted by children, which is going to be a whole new study in the future, but I'd like to put that out there. In regards to approaching immigration, there is a huge disclaimer that I want to make up front here regarding therapists are very much encouraged to engage in self-reflection regarding not only our own level of comfort, but our level of competency related to immigration before we engage in these conversations. It was very unfortunate to hear the lived experiences of those who shared, I want to do right by my clients and I want to offer resources, and unfortunately I have no knowledge and no background because of items outside of my control, such as intake paperwork with questions that I cannot edit. Sometimes because folks see, legal related questions, folks will interpret that as immigration, come in and see me trying to talk about immigration, but I have no training or background in the topic. So also acknowledging where our limitations are and potential areas of growth for us to be able to support and engage in these conversations. So starting off, for those of us that say, I have a little bit of training, I do have some background, and I want to invest in these conversations, it's an opportunity for us to revisit and reinforce confidentiality. It's very similar to the first theme. Acknowledge our own level of knowledge pertaining to the immigration-related issues or background or status. But most importantly, again, hearing their history related to their immigration experience and not just assuming that it's a negative one or a positive one, but really just understanding the level of influence that immigration may play on the Latinos clients' day-to-day living. For example, someone who has just immigrated here, this may be a very fresh topic versus a third generation who has been here for many generations, and immigration is actually not something that is a relevant topic to them day to day. So just holding some therapeutic space for them to be able to process this, and we can easily inquire about it. And if the answer is no, like that's not really a concern, it's one of those things that we can continue forward. But when these implicit messages come up of concern or worry or impact, that is when we as therapists can make that transition to create that explicit conversation. This third theme of unpacking generational cultural expectations. Now that we have, ripped off the Band-Aid, if you will, and started having these conversations a little bit more explicitly, our clients are now hold this vocabulary, this new language, if you will. Now we're also able to start, between the trust that we have, the knowledge that we have shared, we can also start to unpack some of the root of the concerns that these Latino parents have regarding these topics. So the first overall sub-theme that came about was supporting Latino clients to navigate the cultural similarities and differences shared across generations. So this went beyond parents merely stating this, common phrase that we've probably heard of back in my day. It actually went a lot more beyond that. Therapists started to acknowledge that the social context and the environment in which the families live in now, aka the US, and the social evolution, it almost put a pause on the rest of their lifetime. So essentially, parents who had recently migrated to the US, whether they were immigrants or first generation, they would share things like, my child is dyeing their hair, and we don't do that in my culture. We don't do that back home. But they had been here for at least 5 years. And the therapist being able to kind of shift that concern and saying, I'm pretty sure that children also dye their hair in, Mexico or country of origin, and kind of acknowledging you know, that play button on life continues. Even though they have relocated, their society is also changing just as much as all the additional changes that they're experiencing here in the US. So normalizing that changes are rough, they're hard, and they are happening everywhere. And part of being able to kind of get an understanding of these generational differences, I have said this to my students, and the therapist in this study actually said it to me: when in doubt, genogram it out. It is a fantastic opportunity for us to be able to gather a family history, and a cultural genogram will be able to get to some of these nuances for those of us that may not be as familiar with them. We have our basics and our fundamental training in which we can learn to adapt quite a bit, and there's plenty of literature to help us gather the intentional information that we're looking for that could ultimately get us to this type of information that we're talking about right now. There was also a sub-theme noted about creating space for cultural conversations, where essentially therapists were talking about being able to, while they were working with Latino families, they also noticed certain hesitations that would come up in topics and conversations happening. So one area that they identified was perhaps having an individual session with parents to be able to address some of the difficult or uncomfortable topics related to ethnic racial socialization prior to having children in the room. One of them being gender and sexuality, where parents were very uncomfortable in not knowing how to support their child, where they wanted to be able to be supportive, but not having the understanding or the knowledge, and also feeling guilty of putting a burden on their child. So the therapist would actually have an individual session, again, someone who was very comfortable and confident in this topic, and saying, this is how I identify, this is who I am, and this is my area of expertise. I want to be able to give you that space to have these conversations. No question is off the table, because if we can practice and we can, that can help you facilitate and guide these conversations in here, perhaps it'll also create a rich opportunity for you to continue these conversations with more reassurance and confidence outside of the therapy room with your child, and ultimately have that indirect impact. Another area was garnering generational viewpoints, where we were essentially acknowledging the generational shifts in the types of conversations and relationships observed by the Latino families. So while therapists really emphasize validating the experiences and gathering insight of what the Latino parents have experienced and witnessed, it was also about engaging and helping them understand the future generations and the direction and trajectory that their children were going. So very point blank acknowledging that, yes, our or your, depending on who the therapist was, culture is very important. And also, you are raising a child in the US. So having differences is going to occur. So how do we find that balance to be able to empower for you to share your stories and your lived experiences and validate the changes and the different exposures that your child is currently growing up in? We were also talking about promoting breaking generational change by reevaluating some expectations that parents wanted to pass down to their children. So one of them being this machismo, marianismo values within the Latino culture. One mother was talking about how she came to the U.S. and was living with her mother, who was an immigrant, and her daughter. And you had 3 generations living in one household, and the therapist sharing how mother was almost caught in between, where her mother, so the grandmother, was really a maternal figure and saying our values are at home. Our values lie in you raising the child, you being present at home, and mom working full time and managing the household saying, I want my daughter to witness something different. My mother sacrificed everything for us, and I value that and I appreciate that, and I want to make a change, and that generational shift is appropriate and can happen. So the therapist stepping in to validate this experience and witnessing the 3 generational mark, sometimes just acknowledging that makes a huge difference, and that it's scary, it's a new change, but it is still possible to have. The final sub-theme here was talking about supporting parents to raise bicultural children, and once again, discussing these avenues and balance of cultural expectations, but a real emphasis here of remaining respectful of the Latino parents' cultural values and beliefs. So not wanting to diminish what it is that they're talking about, and also introduce the hardships, in a sense, that come with managing these dual roles, where some children don't feel Mexican enough, for example, or American enough, and trying to find their balance, and acknowledging to the parents, you're doing the best you can to keep those cultural values instilled in them, and also how do they navigate living in the US society and US culture. One of the difficult balances where therapists called out a limitation, and also what is being identified as a rising concern in the literature, is this what is called shared language erosion, where from one generation to the next, parents may only speak Spanish and children may only speak English, and the only way that they're able to communicate is through a bilingual therapist. So another additional layer to all the hardships that are already being faced, now you have an additional barrier of communication. And this is where therapists really found a roadblock of how do you overcome something like that. And it was a genuine concern that many therapists actually were starting to identify and share concerns about, without having a real direction as of yet, because there's only so many limitations with 1 hour a week, or having an interpreter, or learning a new language, a couple of barriers to talk about in the coming future. This final thing of contextual practice influences and ongoing development, essentially, once therapists talked about these, 2 very bulky themes of surrounding ethnic racial socialization, they also talked about the importance of this continuing development for themselves. So one way to do that was growing from their own experiences and talking about the importance of self-reflection, some of them regarding their own upbringing, when they were able to relate to a lot of the conversations that were presented by the Latino parents, or perhaps the differences for those who could not relate. They also emphasize the importance of seeking continuing education and training aimed towards the knowledge of culturally relevant practices. And also, reflecting on their interactions and influences by the Latino clients they are serving, and talking about how important and rich it is for us to be able to learn from them as well. So yes, training and education and literature is fantastic, but the lived experiences and those that we're working with can also help us grow to be better for the next client that we're also working with. And finally, they also talked about the importance of advocating for justice, where therapists no longer accepted and would not accept just acknowledging these conversations anymore. And many of them shared that it is no longer enough to just say, I hear you and I understand. But now it's about taking these extra steps as therapists ourselves to see how we can dismantle the injustices that our clients are facing. So one way that three therapists actually shared was related to immigration. They actually got trained in being able to conduct immigration evaluations for folks that are going through this process, and saying that in addition to me having resources in the therapy room, I also want to make sure that this can translate in other areas. Other therapists went as far as saying, my clients have my phone number, and when they encounter injustices because of a language barrier, they know I'm the person to call. And if I have to be on the phone with another healthcare provider and saying, this is what they're saying and you're not listening to them, then I'm going to advocate and I'm going to be on the phone to support them. So really demonstrating this allyship and showing the Latino parents that they have someone and that they can continue to empower their voice and show their children ultimately that they also have a voice. So how does this translate for us moving forward? And essentially, a lot of what we've talked about today is talking how these conversations are going to begin with the self, right? With ourselves and engaging in self-reflection, adapting to some of the practices and that we are used to engaging in, but how do we adapt them to make sure that they are also supporting the Latino clients that we're serving? At this exo level or additional layer, we're also extending the knowledge and resources that we have, where we may be able to extend this to our Latino clients, and ultimately those Latino clients that we're working with are going to pass it on to the next generation. So even when we may only be directly working with Latino parents, we're ultimately indirectly influencing the children as well. And at this macro level, by continuing to have these conversations and no longer accept these injustices, we're also promoting this advocacy for larger societal change, which can ultimately continue these efforts regarding social justice efforts. So we all kind of fall in these different layers, but really what these findings and these tools that I'm hoping you all walk away with show you, and this is kind of a breakdown of how these tools ultimately create a ripple effect outward. And then just some final conclusions regarding where the future directions of the literature. Essentially, we have been able to identify within this study that in addition to parents, teachers, peers, community, family therapists are also very valuable social agents that are able to help equip and support Latino parents with engaging in these ethnic racial socialization conversations and ultimately increase these protective factors against ethnic racial discrimination exposure. However, there's still plenty of work to do. Now that we've heard from the now that we have heard from family therapists, it's now time to translate these findings into the community and see how much the Latino parents themselves find these helpful, and what they think about these findings as well. But also being able to maximize the culturally relevant practices that we engage our Latino parents with and offer them the resources needed to be able to navigate society. And this is my information for anyone. I'm just going to stall here for a second for those who would like to write my email down. I'm always happy to continue these conversations. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, or would like to continue this conversation. These slides will also be shared with you all, so you are going to have access to them. Feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions. Okay, I am going to stop there and go ahead and open up the floor for any questions, either in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, please feel free to do so. It was also a lot of information, so I appreciate y'all sticking around. Any questions at all? Curiosities, even a reflection of like, wow, okay, I walked away with this, or I've experienced this differently. Anything goes. Oh, okay. Thank you. Dr. Bronco, can you share what the next topic of your research agenda is that you mentioned? Oh, this is a great question. Thank you for asking. Oh, go white. Okay. Sorry. And so this is a really great question. What I'm hoping to do now, because my ultimate passion really is to equip family therapists and therapists in general with more culturally relevant practices. The findings from this dissertation and essentially the slides that you have witnessed today are what I'm hoping to start with conducting a small pilot study where I'm going to be able to do more observational data or gather more observational data between therapists and Latino clients, and being able to see when we can teach family therapists to use these tools to engage in intentional ethnic racial socialization conversations with Latino parents and families, how relevant it is for the Latino parents and families themselves, and how can we continue to adapt and modify these so that it can ultimately become a more tailored training opportunity for family therapists. So there's quite a bit of a trajectory here. There was quite a bit of data that actually wasn't touched as well. Now, something that I noticed, and which was a really great finding, but outside the scope of the study, was that most of the literature regarding ethnic racial socialization is like a one direction conversation regarding parents transmitting messages to children. But a lot of the data that I have remaining was actually family therapists identifying that now children are the ones actually either starting these conversations or engaging in these conversations back and forth, whether it be the things that they agree with or disagree with. So better understanding this bidirectional effect and how now that generations are changing and adapting and evolving, how the concept of ethnic racial socialization in itself is going to adapt as well. It'll be very interesting to see. Yes, and those of you that are here for the children piece, yeah. So indirectly for now, and hopefully directly impacting in the future, right? Um, Wonderful. I'm glad that folks are finding it helpful. Thank you for the feedback. I appreciate it. Does anyone have any additional questions? No limitations, please. Yes. Dr. Bird, is that correct?
Unmuting myself. Hi, from Seattle.
You're fine.
I'm curious if this came up in your data. I'm thinking about working in community mental health settings with those intake documents that you referenced where questions are asked. And I wonder, thinking about advocacy and allyship for the therapists and clinicians, if part of what they end up doing is going back to their organization to talk about those documents and to ask for changes.
I appreciate the question, and with the therapist's permission in this particular instance, we actually paused our interview about halfway because they did get quite emotional in the fact of saying and sharing with me, their they attempted they attempted to speak with their organization, and it was essentially shut down right away, that we're not removing this information from the intake form. And in response they said, okay, well, if we can't do that, are there ways for us to get training in this? And unfortunately it was fund limitations. Other therapists who encountered different types of barriers, specifically regarding language, it was asked for folks to have interpreters in the community organizations. And unfortunately, the feedback that I received from the therapists were that some of these organizations said, sure, you're going to bill it to your client if we do that. So there's continued barriers and systemic issues that are unfortunate because a lot of it had to do, at least from this very small, pool, depending on the geographical location. Where there was heavier Latino populated areas, it appeared that there was more resources and more of a prevalence to get these aids versus folks that lived in areas that were much more rural and had much smaller representation, and the response being right away of, we don't have resources for that.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. I appreciate that you brought it up. Ooh, if I may, Gina, do you mind expanding on that? I just want to make sure I understood the question correctly. Sorry, you're like put on the spot now. You're like, okay, let me type as fast as I
No,
can.
no, it's
Okay.
hi. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
And at this time, I have so many distractions around me. I can't use the video, so apologies for that. And but what I meant here is that sometimes people who are very much into their religion, kind of at a fanatical level, they tend to disagree with every other thing that looks outside that paradigm for their children, be it, participate in sports or, dyeing their hair or, whatever that may be. So, I don't know if you've ever faced this kind of fanatism, but, parents can be extremely, they suffer from the anguish of, let's say, disobeying disobeying the religious tenets. So it's a very tricky one, because then the relationship with their children tends to suffer quite a bit. And I wonder if you've ever faced this kind of obstruction of growth for first and second generation youngsters.
I appreciate the question and thank you for clarifying. So me personally, I have not within my own clients that I have seen. Some of the therapists in the study spoke a bit about this in not such an extreme fashion, but they did speak to those who identified as religious or had spiritual beliefs that were very firmly rooted. Folks that tended to essentially their responses kind of came back to you really have to start with that humility and start with that joining, and the reason that therapeutic relationship is so important in order for them to get to the point of like even hearing us of what recommendations we may have. We have to sit and understand and listen. For one in particular, one case that was shared in particular, I do remember the therapist sharing that daughter actually held very firm values, religious values that parents did not, and parents tried to talk child essentially out of that religion, and the therapist came about it in a way where it was more of understanding and being able to also shift the language a little bit. In this instance, it ultimately came down to the Latino parents were not familiar with these religious practices. It actually fell outside of their scope. And there was a concern of like the loss of culture. So when the therapist was able to identify that piece and kind of share that with child then all of a sudden softened up to parents. That was actually a dynamic change there. So it opened an opportunity for a little bit broader of a discussion where it's more of, we just don't have the quote unquote education, and we want to understand a little bit more, and opportunity for daughter to say, I'm still very firmly rooted in my culture, and that my religion does not take from that. So that was about the only situation that I can think off of the top of my head that came up relevant to your question, but it's definitely something to keep in mind because I do know folks encounter it. I have not at this point, so I guess I'll limit myself there.
Thank you. That was very pertinent. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Alrighty, folks, I am happy to stick around for a few more minutes, but I know you have other fabulous sessions to get to. I want to thank you all so much for your time today, and I appreciate you popping in. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.